Hello, folks. Welcome back to World War II TV. The Ministry of Ungentlemanly Warfare was a fun Guns of Navarone style Guy Ritchie romp that came out earlier this year. It was based on the book by today's guest, Damien Lewis, who will talk about the real Operation Postmaster. But of course, we'll talk about other things as well, because our conversations do tend to go a bit kind of sprawling. But it's been a while since I've spoken to you. So welcome back, Damien. How are you?
Yeah, I'm good. How are you? It's really good to be back on the show. It's been too long.
It's been too long, and we'll obviously invite you back to talk about the new book, because Daggers Drawn is out this week, isn't it?
Yeah. We launched it on Wednesday at the Imperial War Museum in Belfast, and the lovely thing is we had at least 6 family members in the audience. That's sons and daughters and grandsons of and granddaughters of people in the book. It was actually a magical evening, seriously magical evening, because I told their individual stories, and then got each of them to stand and say there is the son or the grandson or whatever it was. It was really, really special, really special.
Wow.
Yeah.
And one of the things that occurs to me is, in writing about the SAS and Special Forces, because your new book is more kind of 44, 45, but we're going back to 42 today, is that by flitting across the eras like that, you can absolutely see that kind of professionalism develop with these forces, because it starts off like, who's got an idea? I've got an idea. Let's go and do this. And then by the end of the war, all of these organizations, SOE, SAS, Parachute Regiment, etc., so they've all become a much better version of the kind of foundling ideas, and Postmaster, as we'll discuss, kind of is bridging that gap from kind of I've got an idea, chaps, to the professional force they came. You must sort of see that revolution. Do you see it as an evolution or revolution? That's a good question.
Yeah, of course, and bear in mind also, the war they're fighting, like Daggers Drawn, it's summer 44 through to the end of the war. It's much more bitter and bloody and hate-fueled and desperate. So they're fighting, and it's in a far more challenging terrain, because they're not in the North African desert. Guerrilla warfare requires either big, large open spaces where you can just roam freely and you can hide and you can set your bases up and carry out your operations, or it needs a local population who are friendly and receptive and will shelter you and not betray you to the enemy. They had that in North Africa. They kind of had it in France with the French population, but the more they drive towards Nazi Germany, the more difficult and challenging it becomes. So they have to be more professional, and they have to be tighter in their operations, and they certainly are. It was a Heath Robinson affair, in the summer of 1941, when they, founded the SS in the North African desert. So, yeah, that evolution is very much there.
It's interesting. Neil Cherry yesterday was talking about the 1st Parachute Brigade in North Africa, where people like Brigadier Hill are just literally looking out the window of the aircraft, trying to find a drop zone. What looks suitable for us to land at. Well, you can't get away with that when you're starting to do operations into France and Germany, because you've got to consider flak and all those kind of things there. So, in a weird way, the fact that they could get to grips with the concept of special forces in North Africa, or in this case off the coast of Africa, kind of was a blessing in disguise, in that they could go into these kind of, in a sense, remote area. Well, not in a sense, they were remote areas, and learn the trade.
Yeah, absolutely. Bear in mind, in France in summer 44, they go in, some in the hours immediately prior to D-Day, but most in the hours after D-Day, on these deep penetration, behind-line sabotage operations. Bear in mind, not only they're parachuting men and material in, drop containers, parachuting in jeeps. They're dropping jeeps from the bomb bay of the Sterling aircraft on a specially designed, steel skid with the parachute at each corner of the vehicle. Things have moved on greatly since the earliest days, and they cut their eye teeth in operations in North Africa and Postmaster on the high seas, where arguably it was a great deal easier.
Yeah. So let's get to grips with Postmaster, because obviously our launching point today is the movie, which I've seen you talk about it, and it's a fun romp that has one foot kind of firmly implanted in reality, but the rest of it is taking it into areas of pure where eagles dare type Guns of Navarone excitement, and that's, and in many ways it was all the better for it, for being not taking itself too seriously. But the real operation, as we will find, was very serious, and the people who came out of it were decorated. Very few of them survived the war. So take us back to the genesis of what Operation Postmaster was all about, how it kind of brings together the concept of when it's commandos, it's small scale raiding force, it's all this. So give us the genesis of the idea.
Well, the genesis of the idea of Postmaster was that there were these 3 enemy vessels, 2 German and 1 Italian, discovered in the port of Fernando Po, coast of Africa. There it is on the map. It's actually called Bioko today, but it's called Fernando Po back then. And it was a Spanish colony. So these 3 vessels were discovered there, anchored in the harbour. And the suspicion was, and the intelligence that was gathered by the SOE, the Special Operations Executive guys on the ground, was these vessels were very likely acting as covert U-boat resupply and rearmament and repair vessels, because obviously it could repair them there and not have to sail them further north. It was great for Atlantic raiding operations. And so obviously the sensitivity then becomes what to do about it, because they're not anchored in an enemy harbour where you can just fly over and bomb them, or sail your warships up to the harbour entrance shell. They are in what is formerly neutral territory. So if you carry out an operation in the harbour of Fernando Po, you are, by its very nature, violating Spain's neutrality. That might force Spain to join the war, and Spain joining the war could close the Mediterranean to British shipping with calamitous consequences. So the stakes involved in putting together a mission to do something about ships, but I mean, Paul, they were inconceivably high. The thing that I find most extraordinary about the mission is not how they did it, or the fact that they pulled off, whatever it might be. The thing I find most extraordinary is that Churchill actually managed to get it through, because he had so much opposition from politicians and military establishment, just saying the risks involved in such an undertaking are so great they do not justify the rewards. We all know about high kind of reward, special forces, black operations, that concept. But back then it was this is the first black operation, deniable operation that ever took place. And the very idea that they went ahead and did it is just, it begs belief. I don't know how Churchill got it through. And actually, at many stages on their journey, this incredible journey that they undertook from a harbour on the south coast of England, right the way around the coast of West Africa to Fernando Po. That journey they undertook at several stages on the journey. Every possible obstacle is put in their way by political establishment to try and stop them actually putting it off. So they're not just fighting against the enemy; they are fighting against the enemy within, which is their own high command and political taskmasters, who also just objected to it because they thought it was a very ungentlemanly form of warfare.
Yeah, I mean, and that is ultimately the struggle, isn't it? Is that at what length will the Allies go to defeat the Third Reich? There's this idea that we don't want to become the thing that we're trying to defeat. There's a certain spirit of we're going to fight this war the proper way, conventionally and by not breaking rules. But this is also in 1941 or early 42, when it's a very dark time. A question just came in about this is the beginning of the second happy time for the U-boats. U-boats were a major threat, 41 and 42. The Battle of the Atlantic was the longest campaign of World War II. It brings about the raid on Dieppe a year later or months later. This is a very worrying time, and I'm the old-fashioned politicians are having to kind of accept the fact that will we have to, at least if we don't break the rules, certainly bend the rules of diplomacy and politics, and that's the heart of the story here. Beyond just the actual getting on the boats and going out there and doing what they did, which we'll talk about later on. It's just that ungentlemanly aspect of it, and so that to me is the fundamental part of it. As you said there, this overcoming this inherent desire the British have to play the game properly.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. It's it was an exercise from the beginning to end. This an ungentlemanly warfare and underhand operations, black operations, whatever you want to call it. SOE, Special Operations Executive, was set up by Churchill at the start of the war, and I believe rightly, and I'm sure you'd agree with me. Tell me if you don't. That his concept that Hitler was fighting a total war, war by all means, economic, illegal, whatever it might be, he's going to fight it on every level possible, and we have to do the same. Because although you could argue we're sinking to his level, we're sinking to his level, but we are doing it on the cause of right. Therefore, it's justifiable. So he sets up the SOE to do all the things you're not allowed to do. It's assassination, it's It's corruption. It's raising guerrilla armies. It's, you know, deniable operations. It's running smuggling fleets, like the massive, brilliant, fantastic Musson smuggling fleet that they ran out of Gibraltar, where they took contraband seized in the naval blockade, real smugglers, gave it to their chosen smugglers so they could actually run smuggling operations into Nazi occupied Europe. But whilst they were running those smuggling operations, taking agents and weaponry and bring them out again. You know, that operation by SOE, it was called Musson Smuggling Fleet, because Musson was the British captain in charge. That became a very profitable, self-financing, intelligence gathering and agent running operation. These were the kind of things SOE was set to do. You know, Postmaster was really the jewel in the crown of deniability and that rule breaking. You've got a small bunch of individuals that you can't send out in uniform because you've got to be deniable. That's the key thing. It has to be absolutely deniable. So they set sail in what is basically a converted Brixham fishing trawler, which has been converted into a pleasure yacht by somebody, and then they convert it into a Q ship. So it has hidden weaponry that you can reveal at the push of a few levers. Okay, but the cover story is there are a bunch of Swedish tourists on a pleasure cruise in a pleasure yacht, sailing halfway around the world in the midst of World War II on a jolly. I mean, it's so laughable. If you actually wrote it down on paper and said, this is what we're going to do, no one would, you know, countenance it as being even vaguely feasible. And bear in mind, they're on false Swedish passports, they're dressed in civilian clothing, and they know that they will be denied at every level by their own government. So if they're captured, and this is the serious part about it, Paul, because it is serious, if they're captured, they face nothing but torture and death. There is no other way it can go, because they are going to be treated as spies. They're going to be denied by their own government. So these individuals who step forward, and they're all volunteers, they're volunteering for a mission which stands about zero chance of success. And if it doesn't succeed and they get captured, the very worst awaits them. So they're incredibly, incredibly courageous individuals.
And this is where the movie, we'll talk about the real people, because the movie does, in its movie way, suggest that they're having to find these people in unusual places. You can't just go to, in a sense, the Sandhurst production line and take the next second lieutenant off the end of the conveyor belt and say, right, go and do this, chaps. You've got to be oblique in your way you find it. You've got to find people who are somehow within the establishment so that you know who they are, but without outside the establishment in their ethos, in their attitude. So, you know, March-Phillipps, for example, who the Henry Cavill character. So is he the kind of person that you can easily give a thumbnail sketch of, or is he just vastly complicated as a human being?
March-Phillipps was a complex individual, you know, a many-layered individual, but at its basic, you know, core, he was a guy who wrote, you know, horse racing novels before the war. He had a bit of a hare lip where he'd been bitten by a horse, because he was also a very avid, you know, horse racer himself. And he was the other chap on the screen, Geoffrey Appleyard. He and Appleyard met in a foxhole on the beaches of Dunkirk. And this is important because this is where Postmaster really comes from. They met in this foxhole, you know, on the beaches of Dunkirk, waiting to be evacuated, getting bombed and struck by German warplanes, feeling the bitter bile of defeat welling up in their throats, hungering to fight back. You know, never for one moment having thought the British Expeditionary Force would be so roundly defeated on the French continent. And it's in that conversation the two of them have in that foxhole, they determine the way to fight back is these kind of small-scale cross-channel raiding operations of the kind that then is enshrined in their parent unit, which is called the Maid of Honour Force at this stage, after the boat, this converted Brixham trawler they're sailing, then becomes the small-scale raiding force, and then becomes 2 Commando towards the end of its iteration. So they have the idea at their darkest moment. That's where the concept comes from. And then the central figure, Anders Lassen, he's a classic example of the kind of guy you're talking about. So Lassen, son of a very wealthy Danish, you know, landed gentry family, you know, doesn't really spend a lot of time at school, doesn't really get on with school, spends his time around the estate at, you know, in Denmark, hunting and fishing, and excels with a knife and the bow and arrow, right? And he's 18, he's on the high seas, he's volunteered to go off and be a merchant seaman. War is dead, makes his way to the UK and volunteers for the British military. And the British military try Anders Lassen out, and very quickly they realise there is absolutely no way you are ever going to get Anders Lassen to take on board, drill and spit and polish and discipline. It's just not going to happen. Yet he has this core of incredible skill. He can stalk and hunt and kill a stag with his bare hands and a knife. He's this preternatural hunter and killer. And so where do they send him? Well, obviously they send him to the Special Operations Executive. And where did the SOE send him? They send him to Maid Honour Force. He is exactly the kind of example of the kind of person we're looking for in this kind of outfit. And the other thing about Lassen is, of course, March-Phillipps and Appleyard, their anger and their determination to fight back is born in that foxhole on the Dunkirk beaches, as I've suggested. Lassen, his country is occupied by the Nazis.
Yeah.
His family home is menaced by the Nazis. His family's menaced by the Nazis. So if you look at all the individuals involved, they all have this special reason to volunteer for what is a mission from which the chances of returning alive are very, very low.
Because that's the interesting thing about, we talked about with Neil, that plea Churchill made, the butcher and bolt raids, is that thousands of young men and women kind of attempted to answer that call. But there's only so many ways in 41 and 42 you can actually bring these people into combat. It takes a while to get the parachute regiment of the right size and find them in the right operation. The same with the SOE. You've got to get networks set up. You've got to learn the tools of trade. But at the same time, the powers that be in Churchill, they realize that we need to get started with this pretty soon and just get something under our belt, even if it isn't necessarily going to be the thing that wins the war. Because that's the way in 2024, every documentary about anything World War II, this is the thing that changed the course of World War II. And as very few things are the single factor that changed the course of World War II. Course of World War II. What they do is they contribute a little bit here, a little bit there, and you add them together. But it was important for some of these raids, even if they're not successful, to just actually happen to prove the methodology. And then, as you say, if you've got people who essentially don't mind dying for that cause, you've kind of got your golden recipe there. And that's what I see when I read about these people in your books and others, is they've got it's not a suicide wish, but it's an understanding that not everybody's going to come back from this war if we're going to win it. And let's go in and do it. And if we die doing it, at least we're dying doing something positive and proactive. And that seems to be the common denominating factor in these guys, is this willingness to lay their lives down the line, which, I'm going against what I said in the top of the show about the frivolity of the movie. The movie is a light-hearted romp, but as you said there, if they get caught on this, there's no help from anybody. They can't just be treated as prisoners of war. There's no rules. Essentially they're going into it without any understanding of what their possible fate is, except it's going to be bad.
Yeah, absolutely. Only the worst can happen to them. And bear in mind, you're absolutely right about why we had to do these raids. Because they would change the course of the war. We had to do them. Actually, one of the main reasons we had to do them, and Churchill was brilliant in his understanding of this. And to my mind, Churchill is the father of special operations, without any shadow of a doubt. He loved these men and women and these concepts from the get-go. And he understood you can carry out a raid like Postmaster or many other the small-scale raids we did at the time, and it's a pinprick, it's a mosquito bite in the greater scheme of the war. But the point is, and it happened with Postmaster, the Special Operations Executive, months before they even set sail, had written the press releases to go out to the media with the cover story should they succeed. So the cover story was, they're going to go in and steal ships. What they decided to do eventually, not blow them up, but steal them. Cut the anchor chains, blow the anchor chains, and steal them out of the harbour. Sail them into onto the high seas. And under the rules of war, a British warship could seize them as prizes of war. So the press releases that were going to go out were going to say, British warship HMS Pilot happens to be steaming in international waters off Bioko. 3 ships steam onto the horizon. Their crews have mutinied and sailed onto the high seas, and we've seized them. Now, of course, neither the Spanish nor the Germans or the Italians, for that matter, are going to believe it. They're going to know it's a pack of lies, but that's not the point. It has plausible deniability. They cannot prove it's not true. And what it does, Paul, the key thing about it is stories then appear as the headlines in the British press, and it makes the British people think, my God, we've done it. We can fight back, even at our darkest hour. And when the Nazi war machine seems invincible, we've done this incredible operation. And then the next day, those headlines are in the American papers. The British Bulldog fights back. And that means, because Churchill had one eye with everything he did as to what Roosevelt would do, how would he react? And so those headlines in the American papers were also absolutely key. So as propaganda or media operations, these kind of missions are absolutely key.
Yeah, and we've talked about that in the past, is that the measure of success is not just on the military battlefield. It's about the propaganda. It's about hearts and minds. It's about sowing into the mind of every German soldier from Norway to across the Mediterranean, that at some point out of the night, something could happen and you could get a knife in the neck. You could be whatever it would happen. Parachutists, people fly canoes, abseiling down cliffs, down mountains. You are not entirely safe. And that is immeasurable in terms of what effect that has against the Germans. It's like the Doolittle raid, isn't it? The Doolittle raid has very little effect against the Japanese war machine, but my God, does it inspire the Rosie the Riveter to work a little bit harder in the factory that next day and give people heart. And I think that's the key. You're right. The heart of Churchill's success is understanding what this will do to the mindset of the people who are on the side of the good.
Absolutely. The things that we needed, or rather the Special Operations Executive needed, was it needed a success. It needed proof of concept. Bear in mind, it was deeply unpopular. SOE wasn't liked by the mainstream military, because it wasn't mainstream military. They're a bunch of adventurers. It wasn't particularly liked by the Secret Intelligence Service, because they were going out and blowing stuff up and causing havoc and mayhem in places where the Secret Intelligence Service has lots and lots and lots of time carefully cultivating agents very quietly. So it wasn't liked by the political establishment, because it was most ungentlemanly warfare, not what British officers should be doing. So it really, its only champion really was Churchill and a few others. So SOE needed a success. And you look at Postmaster and the chances of success, the gamble on Postmaster is such an unbelievable gamble that's what really is believe about the story. That's the thing that always strikes me whenever I read the book or watch the movie or when I was writing it. How, in the name of God, did this mission ever get the green light? Because the risks involved are so gargantuan if it fails. And if it failed, the degree that the Spanish find out what we were up to. Imagine if they'd all got captured in the harbour and we had been unmasked. It would have calamitous consequences. That might have been an episode that changed the course of the war. That really might have been.
No, absolutely. And that I think the fact you asked the question, how did it get the go ahead, is the $1 million question. I mean, how did it? I mean, Churchill's magnetic personality and being able to bring people along with his ideas and the charisma of these people involved, and I think is part of it. And we talked before going online about the scene at the end with Churchill coming on, and to me that's the scene in the movie that works the best, in that it kind of validates the concept of we can be sneaky, we can be ungentlemanly, and providing it gets some results, which it did, we can carry on with this, and it's okay. As you said there, arguably the first black op in history. And let's talk a little bit about some of the other people, because we've talked about March-Phillipps a little bit, but there's other people. Of course, the main character in the movie is the incredibly seductive female agent there, Marjorie Stewart. So what do we know about her? And Graham Hayes, I think you mentioned earlier, and Colin Gubbins, of course, is the Carrie Elwes kind of the M character. But Marjorie Stewart, I hadn't read about her until I really read your book, really, and the stuff that came out after the movie.
Yeah, well, Marjorie Stewart is played. She's kind of played by Isa Gonzalez in the movie, so that's a real fictional take on who Marjorie Stewart really was. Marjorie Stewart ends up marrying Gus March-Phillipps. Yeah. So when Gus March-Phillipps comes back from the operation, Marjorie Stewart herself was an SOE agent. She ends up marrying Gus March-Phillipps when he comes back. So there is this ongoing kind of like love affair. But in the movie, she's portrayed by Isa Gonzalez. Isa Gonzalez is actually an SOE agent deployed to Fernando Po. And Marjorie Stewart never did that. There were a number of SE agents in Fernando Po, but they were all men, and some of them did carry out the same kind of things that the Marjorie Stewart character in the movie is portrayed as doing. You know, the party that happens, the party they hold ashore to lure all the German officers and the Italian officers off the ships the night the raid is going to go ahead. That party actually took place. It was organised by SOE, and it was organised to do exactly what it's portrayed to do in the movie. In fact, they had two parties. They had a first party, which was a dry run, to make the German and Italian officers come off their vessels, have a party, and realise it was all perfectly fine, nothing would happen. So the second time around, when they came off, they were even more free-spirited and drank even more alcohol with no suspicions, and that was the cover to allow the raiders to get into the harbour and steal away their vessels, because they reasoned, and they reasoned rightly, that without the officers, the German and Italian crews would be far less likely to put up a major fight. So that role portrayed by the Marjorie Stewart figure in the movie, Isa Gonzalez, did take place. This was a male SOE operative, not a female one. And in terms of the Colin Gubbins figures, well, he's the iconic head of SOE. And actually, in the movie, if you remember, his kind of like his kind of like sidekick or his second in command is the Ian Fleming character, and Fleming is the guy who masterminded Postmaster. In fact, Fleming's story is really interesting in terms of this unit, because Fleming came up with several missions previous to this one for March-Phillipps and Graham Hayes and Lassen and these characters to carry out with the Maid Honour, by the way. And in each case, they were stymied by, politicians and high command. Literally, they were just, no, can't do that. It's ungentlemanly, not acceptable. And Postmaster is the first mission that Fleming actually gets greenlit all the way up to Churchill. It's the first one. So this is the proof of concept. And that's what's really important about it, because imagine what would happen if it failed. I mean, if it failed, and we had not been found out, had the British not been found out to have done it, but even had it failed, it would have had serious ramifications for SOE, and it would have had serious ramifications for these kind of operations. The idea that you could carry out deniable operations, breaking all the rules of war, deep behind enemy lines, that would have been something that would have taken a major back step, because it would have failed, and it could have failed in a really calamitous way. So the stakes are inconceivable.
And that's a very good point, because if the team had been captured, tortured, and killed, a dozen lives, a few more people roped in, it's the kind of losses that in 1941 would hardly be noticed when there's the Blitz going on and there's the Operation Compass is happening in North Africa. But the diplomatic repercussions, the political repercussions, the powder keg that is the neutral country of Spain, and what Africa might have responded, African countries one by one. And there would be no way of predicting that. Really. There would be no way of, you can look at a military operation and say, okay, the aircraft might have engine failure. We may not get there. We may not get to the drop zone. We may lose all these people. But in an operation like Postmaster, you can't have a meeting and say, well, what could happen? There are so many permutations because, as you say, that it's all hinging on this plausible deniability of what everybody realized was clearly a lie. I mean, and that, to the fact that as you said, got given the go ahead, that I can only imagine that there are lots of head scratchings, but we can't do this at the meetings.
Yeah,
and what
absolutely.
happens if this happens?
Yeah, no, I'll give you an example of the obstacles that put in their way. So after they've managed to navigate the Maid Honour all the way from southern Britain to off the coast of Africa, they dock at Nigeria, and the plan is they're going to pick up a load of British soldiers to augment their force, and some extra vessels and tugboats to tow these ships out. The military commander in Nigeria point blank refuses to help them on any level whatsoever, because he doesn't want the mission to go ahead. And so what they do is they go and meet the civil governor in Nigeria, and he's got a completely different mindset, and he asks for volunteers from the civil service in Nigeria, and a load of like 50-year-old teachers and surveyors and engineers step forward. Most of them are First World War veterans. It is literally Paul, a volunteer dad's army, and they step forward and they get recruited into the Maid of Honour force, and they've got 48 hours at sea to learn to use their Tommy guns and to row these these foldable canoes, and that's the force that sets off. If you wrote it as the script for a Hollywood movie, people would say that, come on, that could never happen. This is exactly what happened. So all the way along the line, they have people trying to stop them going ahead.
I mean, even just trying to explain, because I was reading on Wikipedia and things, they're even just trying to explain the political structure of that area of the coast of Africa. It's complicated, isn't it? It's, it's, you can say, okay, well, it's a sort of a Spanish colony, this bit, but it's not that simple. That, like any of those kind of places, there's this, if you were living there, there was this unwritten kind of understanding of how it all works. But I don't think anyone can actually quite explain how it all works, because there's all these people that have an element of power there. And you get this, people mention the sidebar, the raid, the Sea Wolves raid into Goa, that was also a movie back in 1980 with David Niven and Roger Moore, that kind of strange thing of what is neutrality, because neutrality isn't a single status in World War II. There's neutral and there's neutral, and this is an environment that is, the people there are trying to kind of hedge their bets to a certain extent.
You're absolutely right. I mean, bear in mind, the governor of Fernando Po was a diehard, fascist supporter, and actually, the SOE, they carry out this brilliant operation to subvert him. It's so good. So the SOE agents who were there in Fernando Po were there under diplomatic cover. They were posing as working at the embassy, or and what they do with the governor of Fernando Po is they realise he has a local mistress. Okay, so they managed to photograph him with his local mistress in his bedroom, and she's naked in the bath, and he's watering her with a watering can with a view to whatever was going to happen next, you could imagine. And they present him with those photographs, and they say, we can either keep these quiet, or we can make them public. Your family and and your government will see them. And if you want us to keep them quiet, this is what you have to do. And they even get him to allow them to use private aircraft to fly over the harbour and take the reconnaissance photos, one of which you're showing now, of the harbour, by which they managed to plan the operation. That's the kind of skullduggery and ungentlemanly operations that were required to mastermind this brilliant operation. It was a brilliant operation, and the masterminding behind it is so Machiavellian. It's just brilliant in its Machiavellian. It's fantastic. All those moving parts that they had to put together, and they pull it off.
And that's the extraordinary thing, because I've seen some websites that kind of are poo-pooing the actual results of the Postmaster. Okay, well, it's just 2 or 3 ships. It didn't really do this much. How many Germans Italians were captured? Blah blah blah. It's a, as we said ourselves, it's a pinprick in the war effort. And in that regard, they're kind of right. But this is, as you said, it's setting the stage for, it's opening the door for the type of skullduggery that would become routine. If the Allies are going to win World War II, they're going to have to play with the gloves off. And that's essentially what Churchill is saying, isn't it? Because we could clearly say that the British Army of 1918, the British military that ended First World War, was the most professional force that ever existed. But it was very much by the book. It had revolutionized, brought in tanks, brought in this, but it was very much a rule-playing organization. But in 41 and 42, when the war is going against the Allies, you can't keep following the rules. Otherwise, we're on our knees. We've got to do something. And that's the story of this, as I say, is the fact that it got the go-ahead, that it opens a door for more things. And the extraordinary things the SOE got up to, and not just in Northwest Europe, but in Burma a couple of years later, and what they're doing across the globe there. You've got to start somewhere. You've got to prove that being sneaky pays off.
You're absolutely right. By the end of the war, SOE was an extraordinary organization. It's sad that we've lost like 85% of the files, or they were destroyed at the end of the war. It's a real sad thing, because there are, there would be gems in there. But even with what remains, the kind of missions they were carrying out was so brilliantly inconceivable and unimaginable that they're delicious. So, for example, SOE was making so much money by the end of the war, that there was a directive sent from one of the ministries to SOE saying you have to falsify your accounts to hide, to obfuscate how much money you are making. They're making money by currency manipulation, by trade the black market, by those kind of smuggling operations that I was talking about. They're basically running a series of self-financing, intelligence gathering, and sabotage operations. You know, by masterminding and controlling the underworld. You know, it's really on the edge of what's acceptable, but it's brilliant and it's exactly what we needed. And this mission proved, it was proof of concept, proved you could conceive of and execute the most inconceivable operation, which on paper had no chance of success. It proved that individuals would be willing to step forward and soldier on these kind of missions, you know, despite the fact that the chances of actually succeeding and coming back alive were so low. And it proved that you could deny them at the end in such a way that although the enemy really knew what you were up to, you'd still get away with it. That was the birth of plausible deniability in Black Ops.
Mm. Yeah, and I mean, and you're absolutely right. And but as I said earlier, one of the tragic elements of this is how few of these individuals actually live to see even the tide turning, in the sense that they're most of them are dying before the war is even looking like it's going to be won. You know, Graham Hayes has a tragic end. Appleyard in the plane crash. March-Phillipps is buried about 15 minutes from where I live, dying in 42. It's a shame that they didn't really get to see the results of the concept, because obviously SOE as an organization carried on, and but these individuals didn't. And do you think that if you're these sort of people, you're kind of destined not to survive the war? If you're Anders Lassen, that born hunter, the hunter mentality is, you kind of, in a sense, you win some, you lose some. Do you think these gentlemen on screen now, do you think they go into this knowing that their chance of coming out are very, very low?
Yeah, I'd go even further than that, actually, Paul. I'd say that in certainly in Lassen's case, I mean, Gus March-Phillipps foresaw his own death. He wrote a poem about it.
Yeah,
you know, so he had a fatalistic view, and he pretty much knew he wasn't going to survive. Appleyard, you know, Frontiers insists he's not allowed to deploy on operations. It's in 43. It's in Italy, and he's with two SAS, Bill Sterling's SAS, David Sterling's brother, and yet he's not allowed to deploy because you know, Bill Sterling rightly recognises the fact that he has what we would now recognise as post-traumatic stress disorder. He's on edge. He's traumatized, and he insists, if he can't deploy, if I can't parachute my men behind the lines into Italy, at least let me go on the aircraft. He goes on the aircraft. Aircraft is lost, we believe, shot down, and he loses his life. And then Anders Lassen, who's, you know, the only member of the British Special Boat Service and Special Air Service ever to have won the Victoria Cross.
Yeah,
it's to this day, you know, Anders Lassen, towards the end of the war, it's almost like he has a death wish.
Yeah.
It really is. I think what happens with these individuals, and it's so sad, you know, in many cases, that they see so many of the men and women that they've soldiered with become so close to, you know, become this band of brothers, this fellowship, and they see so many of them lost, wounded, injured, captured, you know, crapping out, as they call it, losing their nerve and just breaking up, that almost they embrace death at the end. I mean, if you because the book, you know, is not just Postmaster. Postmaster's the first fifth, if that, of the book. The rest of it chronicles these individuals, and Lassen in particular, throughout the war. And if you read about Lassen's last mission at Lake Comacchio, you can't not conclude that he knows he's not going to make it. You know, it's so obvious he's not going to make it when he storms those repeated machine gun posts on his own. You know, it's almost as if he's rushing towards his own death. And, you know, as you say, almost none of them make it through the war.
Yeah, and Graham Hayes, such a tragic story as well. In that, you know, he in a sense suffers the fate worse than instant death. Is he is captured. He almost certainly is tortured over a long period of time. And we could only we assume he never divulged anything. That's the belief, isn't it? You know, so
Absolutely.
what an incredible guy he was.
What an incredible individual, captured, you know, held for months and months and months in horrendous conditions, you know, tortured by the Gestapo repeatedly, never divulges anything. And then, of course, and the thing with Graham Hayes is he's almost escaped. Remember when he's captured? He's literally almost got to safety. It's at the last checkpoint that he's unmasked. He's taken into German captivity. So, you know, individuals of well, you know, the bravest of the brave, and we must make special mention of the women, because, you know, if you were the real Isa Gonzalez character, you know, and so many of these women in SOE, you know, they went into harm's way, deep into harm's way, with nothing but their guile, their wits, their intelligence, and their cunning to try to survive. And their life expectancy was extremely low, as we know. So these are incredibly courageous people that it's great to celebrate and remember. If the movie brings their story to a younger, wider audience, which I believe it is doing, I'm all for it, because, you know, these people should be remembered and celebrated for as long as we're able to do so.
No, absolutely. I mean, we're not, you know, I wouldn't expect Guy Ritchie to make a documentary like, you know, following all the meetings, following all the I wouldn't. That would be like asking Picasso to do a landscape. You know, what's the point of getting someone to do something that's outside of their comfort zone? And I'm always, I'm fervently in support of anything: video games, movies, graphic novels, anything that sheds a light. The right people will be inspired to go and then dig deeper and find the real stories. And, you know, the actual exploits of Postmaster, what we find intriguing, the meetings, the fighting behind the scenes, probably wouldn't make a very good movie. You know, you had to have the scene, Cavill, you know, bumming up and down with his silent Stenmark II, killing people from the hip. That as silly as it was, that kind of is the thing that will get people to the cinemas or to stream it or whatever. And then, as we just said, people will go on and read about it beyond. And the other thing I think you also pay tribute to is just the men and women behind the scenes, the paper pushers, the people who organize the meetings. Because SOE is by its peak is quite a large organization. You got all these ministries that are involved in it as well, because there was that period, we've talked about it so often, that they all overlap. Parachute Regiment, SOE, OSS coming in, the MI5, MI6, all these other, it's not that their boundaries are very fluid in World War II. People kind of flit across, meeting up. And there must be countless people behind the scenes who were inspired by Churchill's rhetoric, inspired by Churchill. Yes, we have to kind of play dirty, who supported it with the, well, even just a simple thing of perhaps the precision in way in which they typed up reports, made sure that the report got onto the person's desks without spelling mistakes in it, and maybe rewording things, because you can't imagine someone like March-Phillipps, though he was a poet, kind of being able to explain, well, Landers Lassen, explain what he's doing. You know, you don't.
No, there's that wonderful report that Lassen. There's that wonderful report that Lassen writes after one operation later in the book, and I can't use the expletive, but it's the report says land killed Germans, something oft. That's it. That's his report. That's his after act report. So, you know, these guys, they're best at the cold face of behind the lines enemy operations. But bear in mind the legacy as well, Paul. I mean, I was in contact with, you said Gus March-Phillipps' grave is just down the coast from you. So I was invited to the annual memorial for his passing away earlier in the year. I couldn't go. I was doing another memorial, it was a D-Day memorial I was attending, and it was a former Navy SEAL who invited me. So the French were holding the ceremony, but it was an American Navy SEAL and some of his buddies who were going, and that's because they trace their lineage, the lineage of the US Navy SEALs, back to this operation. So this is where we are inventing it all. This is where we're founding this new way of waging warfare. And that's something that, you know, a book and the movie celebrate. They celebrate that lineage, which is still with us today. And it's not just an American special operations units. It's all units around the world are based upon what we pioneered and we invented at these early stages of the war. That's an incredible thing.
And also, I think to build on that is the very international flavor of what these organizations were. I mean, Operation Aquatint, which is the one you talked about on the channel before. I mean, you got a Pole and a Frenchman and a German Jew and a Welshman and a Scot, and it's we like to think of the war. The US are doing this, the British are doing this, but actually, when these kind of forces, the lines blur. You know, Lassen, as you say, a Dane. It was all these bringing these people in for their skill sets, who are acknowledging the fact that they're maybe fighting with somewhat different motivations. Some are fighting for monarchies, some are fighting for democracies, some are fighting from an occupied country, some are coming from across the world. But they've got this shared value of we are the good guys, the Nazis are the bad guys. How can we do this? And I think that's where Postmaster comes home. So we got a question earlier from Andreas: is that were you involved in the movie in any way beyond writing the book?
Yeah. So you're probably not going to believe it, but it's absolutely true. I mean, I could not believe it when it happened. So the producer's a chap called Chad Oman, who's a great guy, and lives in New York. And when they started shooting, you know, they were shooting in Turkey. You know, I was sat here writing at 6 a.m, and there's a ping of a text message on my mobile. It's Chad Oman. He's saying, "Oh, look, you know, we're just redrafting these 3 lines of Churchill speech, whatever it was. Can you just, you know, make them work and make them sound right? Because, you know, you've got that skill, and, you know, send them back to us." And I was like, well, okay, yeah, I wasn't expecting that, but, you know, give me a deadline and I'll see what I can do. And then he'd say, well, we start shooting at 9 o'clock this morning. So I had, like, you know, 2 hours in which to do it. And that happened probably a dozen times throughout the shooting the movie. They were still redrafting the morning shoot, and I was getting these text messages pinging in, basically saying, you know, can you just tidy this up a bit, and we've got, you know, an hour in which you can do so. So that's one way I was involved. Another way I was involved was that, and I'm really glad it's in the movie, is that we have at the end photos of the real people, and their real biographies. And, you know, that it's fascinating, Paul. I mean, I'm sure you know this, but they have these kind of like screenings of movies months before they're actually, you know, the edit's finished. And they had one in London. I went along, and, you know, they screened the movie, and then the test audience get their feedback. And the fascinating thing was, they all said what really got them was when at the end they saw the photographs of the real people and their bios. They said, "Oh my God, it's a true story." That just blew their minds, and they were like, why don't we know about this operation? So just a few things, but really important things that I think, you know, I'm so glad, you know, we had that input and we're able to make sure they're there, because the game changers, you know, people love the fact it's based upon a true story. These people existed. There are real superheroes.
No, absolutely. And I agree with you that the tonal shift at the end, because without that, it did kind of finish a little bit like, and the next week the A team will do it. We'll do another thing. You know, it had that kind of sense of it could just be the first of a whole series of films. But the reality is, you know, half of them are dead within the year. And that was a real kind of, you know, I obviously I knew that going into it, but for a lot of the viewers, they wouldn't have realized that, because, you know, I've stood at March-Phillipps' grave. I can't tell you how many times. So I've been aware of his story, you know, in to some detail for 20 plus years, but a lot of people didn't, because it is early in the war. It was a quite obscure story that they took, but as you've very skillfully said, an obscure story in a sense of the actual kind of on the sea African bit, but a majorly important story in the evolution of well, getting the job done and bending and breaking the rules.
Absolutely, yeah, absolutely right.
So any other things that you think that are important to say about Postmaster, the real Postmaster, that whether we haven't covered, that you would like to get across, or anything about the individuals that you feel we haven't covered?
Well, the only thing that I think, you know, is so shocking is that, you know, you talked about the back office people, a major part of Postmaster was the political warfare executive, the PWE, the propaganda wing of the AOE. They're the people who had to mastermind the propaganda operation. The propaganda operation back home was, you could argue, almost as significant, or certainly took as many people as did the raid itself, because you had to have a whole team back in the UK cranking out the press releases and media coverage, and then countering all the Axis propaganda when they came out and said, we don't believe a word of this, this is an Allied operation. I mean, I'll give you one example because it's just so fantastic. They sent them out there. It's a bit naughty, but then again, you know, this is SOE. They sent them out there with a load of free French hats. So when they actually stole the ships, they threw these caps into the water to make it look as if it might have been, you know, kind of like renegade free French operations somewhere in West Africa. So on every level, they set up the cover story so that the plausible deniability could hold good. So orchestrating that side of the operation, that took real intellect and brain power, imagination, and fantastic planning. That's you know, that's why it was such a great operation.
And just as you said, that we understand the term plausible deniability now because it's kind of in daily use. Look at the world, the politics of the world now. But going back to the dark days of 41, to the idea of constructing a cover story, and not just a cover story, but a ludicrous series of cover stories with multiple strands to them, all of which in many ways are preposterous, but expecting and hoping that it's somehow going to work. It's a weird game of chess, isn't it? Because they would have known they're going to release something. As you said, the Germans have then released something else. The Spanish might have then said something else entirely different, and an independent news channels which might have picked up it would have said something else entirely different. And but that sounds normal in 2024, but in 42 that was new.
No, you've got to try and predict and game, and all of that's really difficult to do. And, you know, indeed, you know, the Spanish did object, and they, you know, there were crowds storming the British embassy in Madrid and all this kind of stuff in the aftermath. But the people at the PWE, Political Warfare Executive, who kind of game planned all of this, they did it very well. And there's a fantastic report that they write, shortly after Postmaster, where they encapsulate what an incredible success it is against all odds. And they're not talking about a military gain. They're not talking about the fact they stole ships to stop whatever they were doing. They're talking about the propaganda operation and the plausible deniability of it all. That's what they're talking about. That sets the tone. That's the game plan. That's the template for all the future operations of this nation that we carry. And we mastermind a great deal of them.
So we had a question from Nick about, were you surprised when they said they wanted to make the film? And I think he means about this specific story, because let's be fair, you've written about, you know, I mean, how many incredibly fantastic stories have you written about over the last 10, 15 years? You could make a whole ongoing, never-ending series of movies. And, you know, we've had Rogue Heroes recently as well that covered things that you've written about. Were you surprised it was Postmaster was the one, or was it a process of discussions between you and them that whittled it down to Postmaster?
No, there was no discussion with me whatsoever. And the reason they chose Postmaster was very simple. They chose it because it's got a beginning and middle and an end. But more importantly, it's the first fifth of the book. And what you pick up at the end, which is that Churchill now has his band of deniable operators. That's exactly what the intention always was. So the next movie, they are then doing the next scenes in the book. So if you remember, they next go on the Channel Islands raids, for example. And then after that, they're doing that fantastic Heraclean mission. So there are any number of these kind of operations that you can then keep bringing them back to do, you know, to do future sequels of the movie. So, you know, at the moment, I've just been sending Chad in America some ideas for what we will focus on for the next movie where the team gets brought back again.
Oh, now I'm all excited now. I'm all excited. And, you know, as we said, it's that anything that's multimedia, that's mass media, brings attention. And sure, we can find criticisms with Masters of the Air and Rogue Heroes and the video games, but otherwise, if the mass audience don't get these types of things, then we'll just end up carrying on talking to the audience we've already got. You've got an audience of readers for your books. I've got an audience on World War II TV, but we need to reach those people who will watch a Marvel movie one week and then they'll watch a World War II one, and then they'll go to the latest Star Wars. And I think that's that from what I was reading, it's those kind of people who haven't perhaps got a track record of watching World War II movies, but thought, oh, it's a Guy Ritchie movie, this will be good. And as you say, the fact that you fought and got that the closings, the credits rolling with the fate of the real people was the moment. Hopefully, those people went, oh wow, this is real. It's not the A-Team.
It absolutely really struck people so powerfully that, you know, this is a true story. And the other point about it is as well, you know, we're losing our veterans, Paul.
Yeah,
we're losing living memory and living testimony. We have almost none left. I mean, I interviewed a chap called Alec Borry, who was one of the last two veterans of one SAS from World War II. Last February, sadly, he died a couple of months later. Mike Sadler, the last remaining veteran of one SAS, died earlier this year. We're losing the living memory. So we've got to find ways to make these stories relevant to young people today, you know, which takes them out of what we do in terms of our books and evenings like this. You know, I tell you what, for me, in terms of the movie, because obviously I got sent, you know, very early copies, and I sat down with my family to watch it, right? So I've got a 15-year-old daughter. She was 15 at the time. I've got a 19-year-old son and 21-year-old son and my wife. We sat down to watch it as a family. And at the end, everybody loved it. Not because it was based on Dad's book. It's a great family movie. And then the next weekend, get this, my daughter, off her own back, chose to watch The Imitation Game. That movie goes to the family movie. Yeah. Man, that's a result, you know? You can't knock that, yeah?
No, I had that same experience a couple of years ago with the Dunkirk movie. I took my stepdaughter, who would have been about 21, doesn't really watch war films. I would never have got her to watch the 1958 John Mills version. She'd go, what the hell is this? And she'd have given up after 15 minutes. But Dunkirk gripped her. And I've dragged her to a few World War II sites, and she's never going to start a World War II TV channel, but it found a place. It resonated somehow, and I think that's all we can do. So another comment from Nick Lahore, who's over in Guernsey, is saying Operation Basalt would be a good film. He's obviously trying to get the Channel Islands in there, looking to work as a location scout, maybe, Nick, there. But yeah, that's the thing, is this opens the door. That's the theme here. It opens the door for many more of these things, and you can see that the success rate improves. They get bigger and better. And then, as we said at the beginning of the show, by 1944, all these organizations, they're standing proudly alongside all traditional regiments as an asset. Here is a viable asset moving forward. You know, as you said, things like Navy SEALs, things like Delta Force, the current SAS, they all have their origins with these completely wacky ideas back in 40 and 41.
Yeah, absolutely. And you know, trust me, Nick, we are looking. The Channel Islands is where I'm suggesting we go next, because the Channel Islands is such a fascinating story. You know, it's the only part of the British Isles that was taken by the Nazis in the Second World War. There's some bad things went on there. We know about the concentration camps. We're finding out more about them. But what was it really all about there? What were they really up to? What were the Nazis really doing with those tunnels beneath Alderney, for example? Yeah. There's a fascinating story there to find out. So if we can go there with the next movie, and we can, you know, shed some light on that, whether it be inspired by truth or fictionalized truth, whatever it might be, there's a great story to be told there. Right? When I wrote that part of the book about the Channel Islands raids, I always thought, why are they going to the Channel Islands? You know, what the raids were, that they sent a few guys ashore to seize prisoners to gather intelligence. I thought, well, why are they after intelligence? What's important about the Channel? You know, I couldn't understand it. But with what's been coming out recently about the Channel Islands and what was really going on there, it starts to be a fascinating conundrum. What is the real story as to what was happening on Alderney, for example? And is that why they were sent in, to gather that intelligence? Because, you know, concentration camp on British soil, that's incendiary, you know? So that's what I hope we will do with the next movie in the series.
Wow. Well, you've absolutely whet my appetite for that. And it's like the aquatint that March-Phillipps died at. We're still not 100% certain what that was all about. You know, that's, as you say, 70% of the records don't exist, but it's coming together now. I think for the Brit, we're going down a rabbit hole, but the British understanding of World War II in Europe, the Channel means that they don't quite fully understand it. I understand it because I live in France, so my French family lived through the occupation, etc., etc. But the Channel Lines is our gateway to understanding what the war really brought about. And I don't mean those kind of silly movies about the kind of the potato society kind of thing that were kind of light-hearted. I mean that real understanding, as you say there, of concentration camps and occupation and resistance, people being shot. That the Channel Islands is our window on that for the British to understand. It's not quite the extent of Poland and the really crappy parts of World War II. It's a window to the darker side of World War II that I think sometimes we'd agree. Us Brits, we kind of look at a light-hearted view of World War II a little bit too much. We look on the fondness of Spitfires flying overhead, and we don't really think about the ghettos that other European cities got. But you know, we can carry on this conversation. We'll bring you back to talk about the new book. But in the meantime, let's bring it. And Damien, it's always a delight talking to you. Long way we continue to arrange these meetings because I get something out of it. I think you get something out of it, and the viewers absolutely do.
Thank you very much, Paul.
Well, I will see everyone again tomorrow. We got the show about Churchill tomorrow, but in the meantime, thanks for your attention. Go and buy Damien's books. I will see you all again tomorrow. Cheers, everybody. Bye.